In July, I was asked to present a program at this conference on the success of the Lebanese. Why are the Lebanese so successful? And I was asked two questions. Why did the Lebanese who immigrated here to America succeed so fast? And why did the Lebanese assimilate faster and smoother into this culture than other ethnic groups? Now, I was intrigued, and I was also challenged, because honestly, I didn't think we were any different than any other ethnic group. So Angela said to me, well, I imagine if you research it, you'll find some interesting information. So that's what I did. What I did is spend some time doing extensive research. Now, one thing, I love mysteries, and I'm a highly curious person. And I'm an adventurer and an explorer. So what I set out to do was to unravel the mystery of how come we don't know that much about the Phoenicians, or for some of us, the Lebanese, our ancestors. And after extensive research, I was literally stunned by what I learned about the Lebanese. And personally, I now understood why my approach to business and politics was different from other people, not only in the past, but in the present time. And as you learn about what I discovered, you are probably going to reflect upon your own life and your approach to life and how similar it is to the Phoenicians. People who came out of the last session said, oh my gosh, now I understand myself. So let me share with you a personal short story, and it was about my career in politics. And as I got into this research, I finally reflected upon my past, and it was through my political career in San Francisco. And it was 1975. I wasn't exactly a political novice. And a coalition had been formed to establish the Commission on the Status of Women, and I was appointed the spokesperson for the commission. Now, I had a vision. I was going to bring together all the groups for and against the initiative, bring them together, create a common purpose, and then together as a unified force, we would appear before the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Now, when I presented this strategy to the group, I had people literally look at me like I was from another planet, another world. And a few people actually told me I was politically naive. The very idea of bringing people who were against an initiative into the room made no political sense to them. And I was informed it could never work because there's always conflict and adversity in politics, and it's going to be impossible to create unity. Now, I was puzzled by this extreme point of view, and that's exactly what it was, a perception of reality. But perception of reality doesn't mean it's real, it's only our perception. And my perception was totally different. So what I did is I proceeded with the strategy, and it worked. I met with all the people who were against the initiative. I developed rapport with them. I listened to them. I asked them questions until I had gained understanding. And once I had that understanding, I then presented to them all the advantages of why it might be beneficial to support the initiative. And then together, as a unified force, we appeared before the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, and after I presented the initiative in a chamber filled with hundreds of people, the board decided to establish the Commission on the Status of Women. So that's what I reflected upon. Now it's 30 years later, and I'm surprised to learn that I'm following in the footsteps of my ancestors. Literally in the footsteps of the Phoenicians, which I didn't know anything really about. See, I come from a 3,000-year-old tradition, a society that survived, thrived, and flourished because they were capable of avoiding conflict, resolving conflict, and living in peace. Has anyone ever heard of a society that's done those three things? Think about it. Avoiding conflict, resolving conflict, and living in peace. And this society, the Phoenicians, was located in modern-day Lebanon, where my ancestors have lived for thousands of years. In fact, my family tree goes back 8 generations. Now, the Phoenicians were guided by 7 principles, and these principles shaped the minds, character, and personality of the Lebanese. And these practices and qualities have been passed down from one generation to another. The Lebanese brain has been hardwired with the DNA of the Phoenicians. So what I'm going to discuss is neuroscience research that is related to the 7 principles. And the understanding of the mind, the understanding of the brain is considered by many people in the scientific community to be the last scientific frontier, because we're just beginning to understand how our brain operates and our mind operates. And what I'm going to talk about may seem highly intuitive to some of you. Go, God, I kind of knew that. But the thing is, they've finally proven it. There's the difference. So the research has shown that genetics determines social behaviors. And it's also proven that the brain is modified by cultural activities. So both social behaviors and cultural behaviors are deeply wired in all of our brains, no matter where we live, which country we live in. So for example, let me explain this. If we keep on doing the same activity or make the same decision over and over again, we reinforce this habit. It's a pattern of thinking. It's a behavioral pattern. It's an experience, and it's stored in our memory files. And the results we create are created over and over again, and because of these results, we can expect the same consequences over and over again. So literally, science has proven that you can connect the dots between our thinking, our decisions, our actions, results, and consequences. And that has major ramifications, because it's basically saying there's no one to blame. Something's going on in your mind that's creating the results in your life. You need to understand how your mind works. So these cultural and social behaviors are passed down from one generation to another, and they're locked into the neural circuitry of our brains. So think about your ancestors if you're not Lebanese. Everyone has cellular memories from their ancestors. And we respond to the world from these memory files that have been passed down from one generation to another. But to understand the Lebanese, we really need to understand ancestral history. So today, I'm going to share with you my personal ancestral history, and then go back 7,000 years ago to see how it all began. And we're going to discuss the roots of the 7 life-affirming principles the Phoenicians lived by. We're going to see the heritage they passed down to the Lebanese, and what legacy they left the world. And by the time I'm done, you will know the tremendous impact each of you can have in your personal and professional life if you embrace the legacy of the Phoenicians, and in creating a new world not only for your children and your grandchildren, but for all children around the world. And I believe you will discover that the 7 principles are the key to how you want to live in all aspects of your life. So personally, my ancestral history began in 1886, when my great-grandfather, Anthony LaHood, left I-2 Lebanon to immigrate to America. And he walked 5 days down this mountainous road till he got to Beirut, and then he was on a freighter that sailed over to France, and then he got himself onto a train. He went to the northwest coast of France, and then he boarded another ship for the Atlantic crossing. And then when he arrived here in America, he made his way across country alone, until he found work here in Peoria. And he was the first man from the village of Aitu to settle in Peoria. Now, to put this into perspective, he immigrated from a small village of about 350 people, buried in the mountains of Lebanon, called Mount Lebanon, which people have been talking about, in the middle of the Middle East, when about 10 million people had already immigrated from Europe, and mostly Northern Europe. And he returned to Lebanon once, and that's when he brought his children and his wife over here by 1990. And around 1907, a flood of Aitu immigrants began immigrating here to Peoria, and all of them found work. And they would thrive in building successful lives for themselves and their families while laying a solid foundation of prosperity from one generation to another. Now today, the Arab population in America is about 4 million people. Now this is approximately because we don't keep census about the American Arab population. But the Lebanese Americans comprise around 35%, or 1.4 million out of those 4 million. And many of them do not identify with being Arab, but with being Phoenician. And that has something to do with where they resided in Lebanon, which was in the mountains. We can explore that further with Q&A. Back to the story. So the success of the Lebanese did not begin with my great-grandfather, or even with the immigrants from Aitu, or the thousands upon thousands of Lebanese immigrants to North and South America, Australia, and South Africa at the beginning of the 20th century. It began in 4600 BC, almost 7,000 years ago, with the Phoenicians. Now, how many of you are asking yourself right now, how come I've never heard about this? Why haven't I heard about these 7 principles? And that's a good question. Because the Phoenicians have been in the shadows of other world civilizations. And it's finally coming out of the shadows. And that's mainly because the Phoenicians were not writers of history, like the Greeks, the Romans, and the Persians. And it's ironic, since the Phoenicians created the first alphabet. Okay? So in the last 30 years, all this new insight and information has come to light about the Phoenicians. Mainly because there's new archaeological digs that have been discovered in Egypt, in Santorini, in Crete, all where the Phoenicians lived along the eastern and western Mediterranean. And that's given archaeologists and historians and scholars new information to shed new light on who was this unique society. And you're going to discover it was very unique. So now all this new insight has been documented. Historically, archaeological, and also new DNA data. And historians around the world are presenting this new information. But I'm only going to discuss the work of one historian. We don't have time for all of them. But he compiled the work of all these historians, archaeologists, and scholars from the eastern and western Mediterranean to create an overview of the Phoenicians. So in 2005, Sanford Hoist, who was a world-class MIT researcher and a member of the Royal Historical Society, wrote a book called Phoenicians, Lebanon's Epic Heritage. Here's the book. It's also for sale out there. And as a child, Sanford loved world history and foreign cultures. And he studied and he read about them in English and French and German and Greek and Latin. He was a real scholar. And one day his family informed him that the Phoenicians traded with the Scots. And he thought, how could that be? How did they get from Lebanon to Scotland in the ancient world? He became so intrigued with this that he started research and he kept with it for 30 years until he had some answers. Now, he would start talking to historians, and they would always tell him there's little to discover. There were the Phoenicians, they traded, they disappeared. They didn't disappear. We still exist. But Stanford was very tenacious. Besides being a world-class MIT researcher, he had a business research degree, bachelor's degree, from UCLA. So he was used to digging deeper. And over the years, as he traveled as an international businessman, he would talk to various scholars. And he lived and explored over 23 different countries. And he met with people in both the Eastern and Western Mediterranean. He traveled to all these Phoenician cities and colonies to do his own investigation. And eventually, he started seeing the picture. People were saying the same thing, but they hadn't compiled all the information. So now he's been presenting this groundbreaking Lebanese research at scholarly events. And this fall, BBC is going to broadcast a 6-part series on the ancient world with all this new information about the role that the Phoenicians played in creating the ancient world. And I'm going to give you some information. You can go to the website later on and find out when they're going to broadcast here in America, because it's being scheduled today. But in his book, Stanford revealed that the Phoenicians prospered for over 3,000 years because they were ruled by 7 principles. And these principles would distinguish them from all other people and cultures during this time. They were extraordinarily unique as a society. And think about it. How many cultures could exist for 3,000 years? There have been some, but wait till you hear this story. Finally, I'm getting to the principles. I know you've been wondering, what are they? The first one, international trade. 2, creating strong partnerships. 3, peaceful resolution of conflicts. 4, religious tolerance. 5, respect for women. 6, equality. 7 is privacy. And vestiges of these practices still echo in Lebanese life, culture, and actions today. Now, how many of you are intrigued and you want to know more? Now, like any good mystery, one clue after another unfolds. You don't want to know the ending of the story in the beginning. So I'm going to take the principles one by one, and they build upon each other. And after we get all 7, you understand why they were so successful and cohesive and operate as a unified force for over 3,000 years. The first principle, international trade. Now, our story begins in 4,600 BC. Hard to imagine, right? When the Phoenicians were building small cedar boats to fish and earn a living. And they lived in Byblos. And Byblos is right above Beirut, of course, in Lebanon. And soon they were trading a half a day from home with smaller civilizations up and down the coast. And then by 3,600 BC, they discovered and began trading with the Egyptians. They had traveled that far south. And by 2000 BC, they were expert sailors and navigators and had been for over a century. And they had expanded their trading ventures to the Eastern Mediterranean. Now they formed a partnership with Crete, and they became the Minoan civilization. How many of us knew that? They discovered the city of Santorini, and Santorini was a Phoenician city. And then they expanded to the Western Mediterranean, and they established trading posts and colonies and cities, and it included Corsica. Sicily was a Phoenician city. Sardinia, Cyprus, Carthage in North Africa, and then the Atlantic coast of Morocco, Spain, Portugal. And like I said, many people think they went to England, Scotland, and even America. Way before Columbus. We're talking thousands of years ago. But as their trading empire expanded, so did their wealth. They would become exceedingly wealthy. So you have to ask yourself, why were the Phoenicians so successful in trading in the Eastern and Western Mediterranean for over 3,000 years? And it all goes back to understanding our brain and how our mind works. Now, this applies to all of us. Whatever we learn from our culture is wired into our brains. And we have these neural pathways. And based upon these pathways, these patterns of thinking, of behavior, we act a certain way in the world. So whatever we learn becomes second nature, and we don't even think about it. Because our culture seems natural. Our behavioral seems natural. It just is us. But when the Phoenicians explored new cultures, they soon learned, like all of us probably would, that other people's cultures and customs were different from theirs. And this became a pivotal moment, or what I would call a transformative moment, that would decide their future. You have to make a decision. What are you going to do? I can judge the other culture and point my fingers at them and get upset and angry that they're different than I am and let them know that. Or I could attempt to understand the other culture. I could accept the difference in that culture, and I could attempt to blend in quickly and assimilate smoothly and change frequently. What choice do you think the Phoenicians made if they existed for 3,000 years without being conquered or fighting? They became accepting and they adapted. They became highly skilled readers of people, and they honed what is today called EQ, emotional intelligence skills. And research shows that people are successful not because of IQ, it's because of EQ. And among those skills, EQ skills, are your ability to listen to and understand other people and develop lasting relationships with them. Now, getting along with other cultures was second nature to the Phoenicians. So can you imagine the world today if all of our brains were hardwired to accept others and their cultures, to change quickly, and to develop mutually beneficial relationships? The second principle, partnerships among themselves and with others. The story continues. We're now at 3,200 BC. An Egyptian leader wanted to build a large temple, but he needed 5 huge, massive cedars. Except this time, when the Phoenicians were there, he said, "I'm willing to give you gold instead of linen or grain." You can imagine that perked up their ears. Wouldn't it yours? So they went back to Byblos, and they had a predicament. They called a town meeting. They didn't have the cedar ships to deliver the product, and they couldn't do it alone. So Byblos was at another one of those choice points, those transformative moments, when their decision that they would make would transform their lives and the world for centuries. What were they going to do? Reject it or accept it? So the entire village got together, and they decided to pool all their resources, all their talents, all their gifts, and they were all going to take a risk, and they were going to fulfill the contract. Everyone would participate in this successful trade. And the entire village basically became like what we would call a board of directors. So instead of being dominated by one leader, everyone joined together to accomplish what a few could not. And they actually succeeded in transporting the cedars hundreds of miles to Egypt. And when they did, unity became the driving force behind future achievements. They understood this is how they were going to build their international trade. And this is how they were going to survive in the future, working together as a cohesive society. So what would the world be like if people in local communities and in state and national politics worked together to achieve a common purpose, develop successful ventures, and prosper? Now, the second half of the principle is even more fascinating, because creating powerful relationships with outside groups would be essential to their existence. And the Phoenicians looked at other people that they were trading with as their friends. And once they had a powerful relationship with Egypt, this allowed them to grow and expand rapidly. And trade began to expand in Lebanon. It went north, south, and west. But from then on, the Phoenicians approached each new culture with the goal to develop partnerships, and this became their cultural norm. And it was stored in their memory files, and they would continue to see the world that way. Now, the first two principles were in place: international trade and creating partnerships with themselves and other people. Now, can you imagine what would unfold in this world if people formed partnerships? If this was going on in the Middle East today, if this was going on between Lebanon and Israel and the countries around them, and the partnerships were advantageous for all people, not just in their own country, but other cultures. We live in a markedly different world. The third principle, creating peaceful resolution of differences. So what did the Phoenicians think, and how did they act when the Egyptians eventually set out to expand their empire? And believe me, all their neighbors were expanding their empires, and most of their neighbors were warlike. And this was a small nation, the Phoenicians. And what did they do when other cultures like the Assyrians and Babylonians and the Persians and many other civilization societies before them set out to conquer them on their own land? What would you do? Now, by this time, remember, they're already a peace-loving people. So war is no longer an option. It's not locked in the neural circuitry of their brain. They respond to the world through living in peace, and they see the world that way. That's how they want to continue to live. So they had to come up with unique strategies. So with the Egyptians, they negotiated an agreement not to be attacked, and they gave them a more lucrative trade agreement. Egyptians would just make more money, and they agreed to it. Now, with other civilizations, they would have to come up with an innovative strategy with other cultures that wanted to invade them. But what they did consistently, they would always go to them first. They would offer them lavish gifts and glittering gifts as a friend before they got invaded. And then they would negotiate a deal that was advantageous for not only the Phoenicians, but the other civilization, the other society. And they did this over and over and over again. So with the Hebrews, what they offered to build them was Solomon's temple, which is a palace of cedars. Because the Phoenicians had been building temples with cedars for quite a while. I remember they built that temple in Egypt that was made of cedars too. So this strategy, by having these partnerships, allow them to be independent and retain their freedom, and to continue leading peaceful lives. So over a period of 3,000 years, the Phoenicians excelled in the use of negotiation and diplomacy to diffuse confrontation instead of going to war. They did not resist conquerors, they did not struggle, and they did not conquer others. The peaceful negotiation of conflicts and diplomacy would be wired into their brains rather than war. And Lebanese today are still hardwired with these memories. They still know how to negotiate. They're still diplomats. But it's up to each of us to make a decision if we're going to act upon those memories. That's the choice. So the Phoenicians lived completely differently than any other civilization and society in their day. They did not live by force of arms. They did not subject the countries around them to slavery like everybody else did. They did not hold down their own people by force or control like other societies were. There weren't any servants. There are no lords in the Phoenician world. Everybody was a partner. And they weren't ruled by fear or deference to one person in a position of power. They literally stood together to survive larger, powerful, and frequently warlike neighbors. So what type of world would we experience if differences were settled peacefully and people would respond to each other from peaceful memories rather than violence, hatred, and anger? The fourth principle, religious tolerance. It's a hot cake today. So let's look at how the Phoenicians dealt with religious tolerance. Remember, they're traveling all around the Mediterranean. Everybody has a different religion. But see, they believed that Mother Nature was the source of all things. And since nature was created by God, they respected it. So in their own culture, they built these majestic temples to honor God and Mother Nature. And they referred to them as Our Lady of Byblos or Our Lady of Santorini, depending upon what city they resided in. And today they're even called Our Lady in Lebanon. But these temples were located in the center of town. And they were a place of quiet contemplation where everybody could appreciate all the abundance in their life. And when they traveled to foreign cultures, they tried to blend in with them. They didn't stand apart or above others. They would arrive in each new land and they would actually admire everybody's local gods and their customs and the individual and the society as a whole. See, they weren't interested in fighting over differences in religion. It would do nothing to help their trade or their future existence. But they really came to understand that others were worshiping gods by different names. So they respected other people's beliefs. They accepted other people's religious preference. Remember, they were really into acceptance instead of judgment. And this was way before organized religion. But religious tolerance would play a tremendous role in not only their relations with people, but their long survival. And they were consistent about this principle along with the other ones. Now, at this particular point, they were socialized to be respectful of foreigners, their customs, their differences, their traditions, their religions, and that became the cultural norm. That's how they saw the world. Respect everyone, all differences. So what would the world be like if all religions were respected, religions were not demonized, and religions were not used to war? The fifth principle, respect for women. So honoring Mother Nature was carried over to respect for women. See, women were partners in the trading ventures, and they participated in the community and civic affairs, and they sat on city councils in all the different towns, and they made decisions along with the men, and they participated in sporting events, because the Phoenicians had a belief that if you lacked respect for women, then you lacked respect for Mother Earth. And Mother Earth, you remember, was created by God. And they were very serious about their faith in God. So while they were honoring the principles of trade, partnership, peaceful resolution of conflicts, and respect for all religions, women, and Mother Nature, other societies in the Mediterranean disappeared or they were destroyed on the battlefield. So virtually, by 1200 BC, all other civilizations in the Mediterranean were destroyed or weakened except for the Phoenicians. The Egyptians existed, but they were ruled by foreign kings. And some of these societies only lasted 300 years. So what would the world be like if Mother Nature and women were respected, and it were socially unacceptable to treat women without honor and dignity? The sixth principle, equality. Now you can imagine the decision they made when they had that trade that they wanted to do with Egypt. They decided that everybody was going to be a partner in the trade venture. Then everybody was part of the decision-making process. And then everybody profited from the trade venture. So the wealth and the risks were shared by everyone in every city they lived in. And if one family participated more frequently in the trade ventures, then of course they were wealthier. But no one family acquired too much of the community's wealth. And no one was poor. No one lived in poverty. So instead of fighting and competing with each other to get ahead, they focused all their energy on creating a common purpose and expanding their international trade. Imagine how much energy gets used over competing and fighting all the time. So when the families of the town acquired their newfound wealth, when they traded with Egypt, guess what they did? They stopped living in huts, and they started building multi-room homes. And you can still see these sites in Byblos today in Lebanon, where these homes were built out of stone. So now the experience of treating all people in their own society equally became the norm, and it was stored in their memory files, and they would continue to retain that principle. One principle after another they're building on. So what would the world look like if all people prospered and were treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their material wealth, nationality, race, religion, or position of power? And for those of you who were here last night, you might recall when Dr. James Zogby was talking about we need to respect all people. We need to operate as a single voice in the Lebanese community. We need to look at how to create a unified force. It's exactly what the Phoenicians were doing thousands of years ago. Now on to the last principle. Privacy in both their personal and professional affairs. I had a number of people come up after the last program and said, now I understand why I'm a private person. It's not because I don't want to share all my secrets or anything. It's wired into their brains. The Phoenicians understood human nature. In fact, you might think that they were probably the first psychologists, because they knew that people had a tendency to attack people who were different from themselves and who were wealthy. And remember, they're wealthy. They understood that humans could be greedy and jealous, so they had to think about how are we going to protect ourselves. Now, when they traveled to new lands and they met new people, and they were introduced to different cultures, they attempted to blend in. They did not want to stand apart from other people. They wore similar clothes. They were learning their language. They were respecting their customs. They were accepting people. So instead of boasting about their achievements or wealth, they set out to develop rapport and lasting relationships. And on the home front, remember, there are a lot of societies attempting to conquer them. So they avoided all ostentatious display of their wealth, and they kept all their treasures in their home and in their temples. But even today, you will see the Lebanese are very private. And in fact, most people don't even know that many famous people today are Lebanese. Many people who are quite wealthy are Lebanese. The Lebanese don't talk. They still retain that privacy in their cellular memory. And many times we don't even know why we're doing it. It's just our norm. It's how we live our lives without realizing we've been programmed that way from our ancestors. So how would the world look today if people did not boast about their achievements or flaunt their wealth, but instead were appreciative of their good fortune and contributed to others' welfare? So clearly, the Phoenicians had what I call a moral code by which they lived their lives, and it was conscious moral code. They decided this is how we wanted to develop our society in the ancient world. And they valued life, freedom, fairness, and caring about others. And they were highly committed to their faith, their family, and relationships. And they became fiercely independent, Lebanese still are today, highly resilient, determined, generous, and gracious. And we still see these qualities instilled in the Lebanese, not only here in this community, but all around the world. And the Phoenicians had a blueprint for success. They were men and women with vision. And it's because of this vision that they did not allow fear to run their lives. It doesn't mean that they had fear at some point. It didn't run their lives. How else could they have branched out and traveled into the unknown, into the eastern western Mediterranean without even knowing where they were traveling? They didn't have maps in the beginning. There was nothing. It's incredible risk-taking. But vision trumps fear. And whenever any of us focus on achieving a vision, we don't operate out of any fear that we have stored in our memory files. So vision allowed the Phoenicians to move forward with this great sense of adventure into the unknown, with this deep inner knowing that they were going to do something different. They were going to travel places that had never been traveled before. And vision connected them on a heart level and on a spiritual level. And it literally provided them with purpose and meaning. And that purpose and meaning is what kept them together thousands of years, because they worked together to achieve a common goal. And in doing that, they could feel good about themselves and other people. And vision instilled in the Phoenicians the ability to be proactive and respond to life from a place of love and wisdom, rather than react from fear and anger and hatred. So the Phoenicians left the Lebanese an epic heritage, and the 7 principles are still alive in the Lebanese no matter where they reside around the world. Now remember what I said. They carry the cellular memory of these 7 principles, but that doesn't mean that every Lebanese lives them. It's an individual choice. You have to choose whether you want to express these 7 principles or not. But they've shaped the mind's character and personality from one generation to another. So as we can see, the Phoenicians, along with the Greeks, Romans, and Persians, were builders of the world. And they left the world a life-affirming legacy. Because remember, they weren't involved in wars. They didn't have a standing army. And if they could survive, thrive, and prosper for thousands of years, so can humanity today if they embrace these principles. And they left humanity with a blueprint for transforming the world, a roadmap for moving forward in a new direction. Now, we desperately need to live in a world without war, violence, and hatred. And this is one vehicle for it. So the 7 principles are a model for leadership. You can use them in your home life to build a solid foundation for your family. Political, business, religious, educational, community leaders can use them to create healthy communities and a life-affirming world, rather than a world with poverty, greed, and violence. And leaders can use the principles as a bridge to peace. Yes, the 7 principles are not only a bridge to peace, but also prosperity, because the Phoenicians lived peacefully and they were extraordinarily prosperous. The two went together. We could also teach these principles to our children and grandchildren. But see, the choice is ours. There isn't anything that we Americans can't achieve once we commit to a vision to work together to achieve what seems impossible today. We've done it over and over again throughout the last 300 years. So when we combine the 7 principles with an understanding of how our brain works, an understanding of how our mind works, we can literally see why the Phoenicians, as well as the modern-day Lebanese, were so successful, and why they became flexible and adaptable in new environments. We can see how they could assimilate smoothly and fast into any new culture. So if the Phoenicians were constantly transforming their brains and building upon what worked for them in ancient times, we too can act upon their legacy today in modern times. All of us have the ability to hardwire our brains by understanding how our mind works. All of us can transform our neural circuitry, our memories of war, violence, and aggression, and we can transform them to ones of peace, prosperity, and equality. And all of us can program our minds to transform quickly. Now, some of you may be thinking, not me, I'm too old, I'm too set in your ways. Anyone been thinking that? But you know, I've worked with thousands of people over the years. This is my specialty. They've come from every profession, business, politics, communities, every generation. Some as young as 10, and some as young as 76. And they all succeeded in transforming their memory files and rewiring their brain. Because our brains have enormous plasticity. And this plasticity allows us to learn and grow and evolve minute by minute. It's basically our choice. Who we are in the world depends upon our choices. Who we are in the world depends upon our choices. And the Phoenicians understood this. Khalil Gibran, he's the famous Lebanese poet, artist, and philosopher, said in his book, The Prophet, "The self is a sea, boundless and measureless." And what I want to remind you is that our individual and collective potential is boundless, measureless, and limitless. And we can develop this potential by embracing the 7 life-affirming Phoenician principles. And when we do, we will have a rippling impact around the world. Our potential will ripple out into the sea from continent to continent, and one by one, we will transform the world, just like the Phoenicians and the modern Lebanese have for thousands and thousands of years. So I challenge each of you to make a commitment in this moment to move out into the world, embracing the legacy of the Phoenicians and the 7 principles, to create a new world, not only for ourselves, our families, our community, and the world. So will each of you make that commitment with me in this moment? Thank you very much.